I am Andrew Cohen, and I am the director of the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics at Georgia State University. I also teach in the philosophy department there. The Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics and many campus partners are delighted to bring you our today's event, The Insignificance of Voting. This is our third of our 5-part series in the fall on the ethics of elections. In each installment, we bring together noted speakers virtually, and as today, we include experts and scholars from across different disciplines. Our events are fostering constructive dialogue and reflection about how ethics impacts the choices that we make as citizens and as human beings. And we do this all mindful that often reasonable persons will disagree about the controversial issues that we discuss. This series is looking especially at how ethics matters for our ballot choices and for shaping election policy. We are especially eager to reflect on how ethics of elections matters for historically marginalized communities. There are further details about this series that is available from our website, ethics.gsu.edu. Before we begin, let me put in a plug for our upcoming events. Next Tuesday, October 13th at 3:45 p.m. Eastern Time, we will convene a panel on ballot access, voter fraud, and voter suppression. Details are available on our website at ethics.gsu.edu, along with details about 2 other upcoming events in October. This series is made possible with the generous support of our co-sponsors, Georgia Humanities and the Georgia State University Center for Human Rights and Democracy. We also thank our campus partners in making this event possible, the Panthers Vote Coalition, the Office of Civic Engagement, the Center for Studies on Africa and its Diaspora, the Department of Philosophy, the Center for Law, Health, and Society, and the Georgia State University Program in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. Last week, presidential candidate Joe Biden looked at the camera during the debate and he implored Americans to go vote. His vice presidential candidate did the same thing last night in her debate with Pence. This idea of the importance, perhaps even a duty, to participate in politics by voting is something that children often hear when they are young. Now, if you go back far enough, very, very few of our ancestors had the right to any say in how power was exercised over them. And certainly, in the United States, that power, once it started to get shared by some people, was not shared or exercised equally. And we often hear stories about valiant struggles in the United States where members of politically marginalized groups fought and were sometimes killed in order to gain or exercise the right to vote, whether it was blacks in the 19th century, women in the 20th century, or young adults in the 1970s. Voting, we hear, is a hard-fought and hard-won right. There are grave and important concerns about ballot access, but at least for now, I propose that we bracket those and here consider the significance of the franchise. While it is often heralded as a key institution for protecting important political interests, building solidarity with members of one's communities, and for keeping political officials accountable, there are some critics. Social scientists will frequently point out that the chance one's vote can make a difference is both unequal across different jurisdictions and typically vanishingly small. Social scientists also routinely document how American voter participation is alarmingly low, and even among those who participate, social scientists often detail how ill-informed voters seem to be about important issues in the public arena. They often do not know who the candidates are. They do not know what the candidates' positions are or how to connect political actors to policies. This might challenge the idea that people may meaningfully exercise the franchise. And yet, the failure to do so leaves historically marginalized groups sometimes lingering at political margins. Our speakers today will help us to continue a constructive conversation about these themes. Joining us is Professor Wendy Smoot. Among Dr. Smoot's appointments are as Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer for the College of Arts and Sciences at The Ohio State University. She holds a faculty appointment as an Associate Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. Dr. Smoot is currently working on a book manuscript, Perceptions of Power and Influence, the Impact of Race and Gender in American State Legislatures, which explores how race and gender impact power and influence. Also joining us is Jason Brennan, who is the Flanagan Family Professor at Georgetown University. Brennan has written several books, including Against Democracy, Why Not Capitalism, The Ethics of Voting, and several other works in philosophy of education, ethics, and social and political philosophy. And we are fortunate also to be joined by Professor Suzanne Dovey. Dr. Dovey is Associate Professor of the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona. Dovey's work has appeared in many outlets and has covered themes such as political representation, feminist theory, and democratic accountability. She is now writing a book titled Misogyny Goes to Washington. You can read about each of our panelists further in the brochure for today's event, which you can find at ethics.gsu.edu or from a link on our Twitter feed at JBB Ethics Center. The format will be as follows. Each panelist will offer approximately 10 minutes of remarks. There will then be a conversation among the panelists, and we will draw on questions from you, the attendees. Please submit your questions to the Q&A section on WebEx, or you may post questions to the Twitter feed for the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics, which you can find at JBB Ethics Center. And repeat that, that's at JBB Ethics Center. We're fortunate that we're going to begin with Dr. Wendy Smoot joining us from The Ohio State University. And again, please read more about Dr. Smoot's work and biography on our website, ethics.gsu.edu. Dr. Smoot, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew, for that wonderful introduction and for setting the tone of our discussion. I'd also be remiss if I did not also thank Donna Hardaway, who seems to be the wind beneath the center's wings. And so I thank her for helping bring this event together. As Andrew discussed in his opening comments, we are at a historic moment of great commemoration around access to the vote. This year, we commemorate the 100th year of women's suffrage, the 150th year of the passage of the 15th Amendment, which granted suffrage to African American males. And then also I marked the 55th year of the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which for African American women in particular marked the real moment in which African American women were adequately able and widespread able to access the ballot and to exercise the ballot. So the reason why I bring up those three significant commemorations that we celebrate this year, it's often hard for us to remember that we can celebrate in a year such as the year of COVID and 2020 as it's been. But we are marking those commemorations, and we mark them because they remind us of the significant battles for inclusion that women and African Americans and other marginalized groups have engaged in to actually gain access to the ballot. And Andrew so rightfully reminds us that at the earliest moments of our democracy's development, very few of us would be considered eligible to participate in decision making, which is a conversation I think we'll have a chance to talk about more as the afternoon goes on. But there's been incredible energy placed around this idea of inclusion in we the people. Democracy has always been an ideal rather than an arrived destination, and people of color and women have had to put forth an extraordinary amount of effort and struggle to be included in the notion of we the people. So I want to uplift the symbolic as well as the material aspects for voting and what it symbolizes. What the vote symbolizes for voters is often this notion of inclusion and belonging. One of the things that we have commemorated or marked was the passing of Representative John Lewis, and we returned to the struggles of African Americans physically on the Pettus Bridge as a form of battle for the right to be included, and inclusion being defined by the right to vote. We also think about the vote as symbolic of belonging and also symbolic of the ways in which we seek social and economic inclusion in we the people. So if we return to some of the early conversations for suffrage for both women and for African Americans, we have to think about the stories that we hear or the historical markers of people like Ida B. Wells, who connected the vote to physical safety and economic stability for the African American community through her anti-lynching campaign that she also associated with the right to vote. And that really makes us think about the contemporary context in which we think about and talk about the relevancy of the vote and its relationship to protest and the protection for Black lives. I very much connect those notions of protest and politics because the vote itself was never conceptualized as the only expression of democracy, but a very important expression of democracy in order to secure both economic protections, social protections, and physical protections under the law. So never the vote alone. The vote has only been marked one mechanism. Then we want to think about protest and politics, and hopefully we'll be able to do a little bit more of that as we move into our Q&A conversation. So because the vote has been so significant and so important to African Americans, to people of color, to women, I want to talk a little bit about how those groups have exercised their right to vote. And I want to focus specifically on African American women voters. It's an area of my research. And one of the things that we want to really think about in relationship to that is that Black women have more than simply thought about the vote. They've exercised the vote. And it's really in recent elections that pundits and political scientists alike have started to pay greater attention to and cultivate a greater appreciation for the ways in which African American women have participated in voting. In particular, in 2008, we saw African American women leading every other group in terms of their voter turnout and voter participation. Many argue that that was a result of the opportunity to vote into the White House, the first African American president, and to bring along with him his family into the White House. Certainly a motivator we found for African American women. But that level of participation was a historical continuation that we began to see since the 1980s in terms of African American women's participation. Certainly in 2008, it was much higher. It was not limited to an Obama effect because even beyond 2008 and 2012, we still saw high percentage of participation or high voter participation among African American women, upwards of 90%. So when we talk about also this notion of women's voting, one of the important things that we must do is to think about the ways in which we disaggregate the women's vote to understand the ways in which women of color and African American women in particular are driving what we mean by the women's vote, particularly when we link that to a partisan conversation, because African American women tend most likely to support Democratic Party candidates. And I want to emphasize that Black women's participation has remained high, even in the face of challenges to access to the ballot that we see following the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. The legislation that I mentioned earlier really first enabled African Americans' participation. And if you've not watched it already, being in many of you in Georgia, I highly encourage you to view the next Netflix film, All In, The Fight for Democracy, that features your very own Stacey Abrams and the work that she's been doing around voter inclusion and access to the ballot. The reason why I want to bring up voter suppression as an important part of the conversation today, as you will take it up next week, is because voter suppression is one of those strong indicators of why the vote is so important in the first place. If it weren't so amazing and wonderful to vote, no one would care about whether or not you were participating or not. But we know and we see in recent actions that there has been as much energy around suppressing access to the ballot as we have seen the energy around trying to get the ballot. So I want us to really think through that point. If it had no value, there would not be energy to suppress it, and the energy that we've seen and that you've witnessed in your own state of Georgia. The other thing that I want to conclude my comments on, because I am energetic and anxious to get into a good conversation here, is I want to return to this idea that voting is but one expression of democratic participation. And hopefully, again, we can talk about the role of protest. But what I've been working on and questions that I am most interested in this current moment is this idea of moving African American women and women of color from being reliable voters to being candidates for public office as a way to think about deepening democratic engagement. We are starting to see the mobilizations of women's organizations. And this is really happening outside, I want to emphasize, outside of political parties who are the traditional ones who identify candidates, who surface candidates. Those political parties tend to work using their networks, their own networks, which tend to be quite homogeneous, which have not surfaced African American women, Latinas, Asian American women in sufficient numbers, yet they are showing up across tickets, and in particular in down ticket races and in local races. So there's a story to be told about how these candidates surface. Where do they come from? And work that I'm doing with another colleague, Christina Bejarano, we are starting to look at how women of color are doing the work themselves to turn women of color from simply reliable voters in the democratic process to candidates for political office. And I want to just end by saying why that is important. And I want to link that back to mobilizations that we've seen over the summer, mobilizations that we continue to see in states like Kentucky over the death of Breonna Taylor, the summer protests that we saw over the killing of George Floyd. When we look at local politics, right, those are the spaces that we are starting to see women of color candidates experience great success. And I'll point to two cities, one, your very own Atlanta, Georgia, and the response and leadership of Keisha Lance Bottoms, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. And also, with Jason on the line, I'd also look at Washington, D.C. and Muriel Bowser's outspokenness in relationship to Black Lives Matter and the way that she was able to represent the citizens of Washington in relationship to the federal government and to President Trump's stance against protest politics. Local elections matter, and who is serving, how they represent, how they connect with communities of color is a way in which we think about the prize of democratic engagement and democratic mobilizations. So it's not the vote alone, it's the vote, it's protest, it's running for political office. All of those things together make our democracy become closer to our ideals of we the people. And I'll stop there and look forward to a great conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smoot, for your remarks. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Jason Brennan, who will be joining us today from Georgetown University. You can read more about Dr. Brennan's background from our website, ethics.gsu.edu. Professor Brennan.
Yeah, I'd like to say once again, thank you for having me here and spending your afternoon with me. It's a great honor to take part in this panel, and I'm sure it's going to be very interesting. What I'd like to talk about is the question of voting as a form of effective altruism or not. The reason I'm thinking about that now is because it just happens to be right now I'm teaching a course on what is it to be an effective altruist? What does it mean to use your time to make sure you actually are genuinely helping people rather than doing something that looks good, sounds good, but really isn't all that good? I'm also teaching another class on why is it people, despite their good intentions, often do things that make things worse? Why is it people who, despite having good intentions, often make bad choices or act badly? And that brings me to thinking about voting. So I'm going to start by doing something that's a bit of a stunt, but it's real. All right. I'm going to, can you see that? I'm going to donate $100 to a charity called Sight Savers. All right, let me just hit the make a donation button. I want to make sure it goes through. The receipt's there. Okay, there it is. Okay. Now, having done that, I did something really interesting. I just did more good for the world than all of us will do, like everyone watching this seminar, when we vote this year. And further, than all of us will do in all of our votes through our entire lifetime. Now, that doesn't mean that voting's bad. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't vote, but it's worth reflecting on what is the value of a vote and what are we really doing. And there seems to be a disparity between the amount of significance we place on voting from a kind of rhetorical perspective and the actual significance of an actual vote. And part of that, I think, has to do with a kind of confusion. The value of democracy as a whole is one thing. The value of all of our votes together is very significant. Together, we have a huge impact. The value of us, any one of us as an individual with an individual vote, is really relatively minor. So why is that? Well, I said something about effective altruism, so let's think about what that means. Effective altruism is basically taking the tools of microeconomics and other sophisticated tools and applying them to altruistic behavior, trying to help people, to beneficence. And a way of putting it is that it's not the thought that counts. It's the helping. If you want to help people, it's not your feelings that count. It's whether you actually help. However, unfortunately, it's very depressing. As a matter of empirical fact, when people go to investigate what makes people give and why they do what they do and where they direct their energies, the overwhelming majority of people are more concerned to look good than to actually help. They're more concerned with doing things that sound impressive than with things that actually do a lot. In contrast, when I just donated $100 there, here's what I did. I added approximately, I did this in order to remove trachoma from people who are suffering from that horrible disease. I've added approximately 120 years of sightedness to 4 people's lives, and I probably extended their expected life years by somewhere between 10 and 25 years. For $100, you can do that. Can you do that by casting a vote? No, you can't, except in extremely unusual circumstances that will not obtain in your lifetime or mine. In fact, when it comes to giving, what we find is this. the majority of Americans say that they care about the performance of the nonprofits or about the performance of the things that they do. But in fact, only about 1 out of 3 does any research on whether the charitable gifts they're considering making has any kind of effectiveness. Of those that do, the overwhelming majority, I'm looking at numbers right here from a study, 63%, do so only to validate that the nonprofit that they're giving to is the right one. They are actually basically looking for information that verifies what they already wanted to do. Really, only about 3 out of 100 people, when it comes to giving, are willing to actually change their mind on the basis of evidence about effectiveness. Instead, what determines how we give and how we act when it comes to altruistic behavior are things that really shouldn't. For one, where we give a lot more when we're visible, when we feel like we're being watched, when other people are paying attention to us. We do a lot more when we're under peer pressure and our giving behavior is directed towards that peer pressure rather than directed towards what's effective. We give a lot more when we feel proximate to the people that we're affecting, which is often a bad thing, because if you're living in the United States, the people that say we consider poor in the U.S. are still like in the top 15% of income earners worldwide, adjusting for the cost of living. And so they're not the most obvious candidates for help. Even if they need help, there are people that need much more help, and you can do a lot more good. We tend to give more and be more likely to do something charitable or altruistic when we relate to the people that we think about, when we can see a face, when we can see someone who's starving, when we can see a story. We don't really act in response to things like numbers and statistics, even though those are the things that really determine whether we're actually doing good or not. And finally, one of my favorite bits is that we're most primed to give when we're thinking about sex and mating. So there are experiments that do things like get someone to think about going on a first date for 10 minutes, and then compare them to subjects who had to spend 10 minutes doing nothing. And the first set of subjects, if you ask them for a donation, more will donate and they'll give more. But it turns out that when we do give, we give almost without any concern about whether what we're doing is effective. So why does this matter? Well, because if you're ineffective as an altruist, you can cause quite a bit of harm. There are charities that not only do they waste resources, but they actually make things worse. It's actually hurting the very people that they're meant to help. And further, it can hurt our character because of an unfortunate psychological phenomenon called moral accounting, which means that basically you're kind of aiming for like a B+ in ethics in your overall character. You're trying to be pretty good but not perfect. And what pretty much all of us do is when we do something nice, we give ourselves permission to do something bad afterwards. There are lots of experiments verifying this. And you can see an example of this with, say, Prius owners. It turns out that people who drive Priuses drive surprisingly aggressively and are really mean to other people when they drive. Part of that is a moral accounting phenomenon. I'm driving a Prius, therefore I'm saving the world, therefore I'm entitled to cut you off. Get out of my way. So that's a primer on effective altruism. What does it have to do with voting? Well, let me give you an equation. I put it in the chat, but I'll kind of hold it up to the board here too. This is the value of your vote. That's it right there, right? The value of your individual vote is equal to the probability that your vote will be decisive times the expected difference in the value between the two candidates. If you vote for the Republican over the Democrat, that's what R versus D equals here, minus the opportunity cost, whatever the next best thing you could have done when you voted, plus the consumption value of voting, how much you enjoy doing it, what sorts of social benefits you get. Now, if you work in the kind of circles I do, if you work in political science or philosophy or economics, or you are those kinds of people, if you're a scholar, if you're an intellectual, you get a lot of consumption value out of voting. It's fun. Everyone expects you to do it. They frown upon you if you don't. So that's really, really high, and it's maybe a good reason to do it. The opportunity cost, what's that? Well, you can do a lot of other things rather than vote, which will have much more of an effect. But the really interesting part is this bit. What's the chance that you'll be decisive, and what's the value of the difference between the value of those two candidates? Well, there's some debate in political science about that letter P, the probability that your vote will be decisive. On one model, the Brennan-Lemaski model of decisiveness, a different Brennan, not me, though a friend of mine, the probability that I'll be decisive in the next presidential election works out to be something similar to the probability that while I'm sitting here talking to you, I will spontaneously quantum tunnel through my chair. No, I'm just kidding. Never happens. That's probably a little too pessimistic, but on the more optimistic model by Edlin, Gelman, and Kaplan, they think you can have as high as like a 1 in 10 million chance of being decisive, but only if you live in one of a few states that are really, really close. So if you're in, say, California or Texas or, Oklahoma, the chances that your vote will break a tie, even on their model, is extremely small, vanishingly small. So that number P here in this equation, It's really, really low. So even if, think of it this way, even if like a lottery ticket is worth a lot if you win, even if like the winning Powerball ticket is worth a tremendous amount, it doesn't follow that buying the lottery ticket's that great of a deal, right? Because the chances of you winning are quite small. But what about the difference in those candidates? Everyone says, isn't it just obvious that Trump is the worst president ever and anyone else would just be so much better than he is and it would be just such a great deal? So even if you have a very small chance of making a difference, you know, the gap between the candidates is so high that must be a reason to vote. Well, you know, I don't know about Trump versus Biden. I'm not super impressed by Biden and I despise Trump. So, you know, there's that. But what about in general? Like, so there's a good paper you can read on this by Adam Dines and John Holbein. It's called Noisy Retrospection. And what they do is they try to very carefully measure what difference does it make at the state level, whether the Republicans or the Democrats are running the state. And let me just read from their outline, remember their abstract. It's that using difference and regression discontinuity techniques, we find that U.S. states governed by Democrats and those by Republicans perform equally well on economic, education, crime, family, social, environmental, and health outcomes on the timeline introduced by elections 2 to 4 years downstream. Our results suggest that voters may struggle to truly hold government coalitions accountable because it's extremely difficult to actually find any difference in the performance of these governments on the basis of who's actually running. It's really difficult to do so. People who have no background in these things seem to be super confident that they can trace how bad it is for one and how great it is for the other. It's actually really difficult to attribute causation and know what difference it really makes. So basically, when we go back to this, it's like, you know, that's really low. That's probably really low. That's pretty high because instead of voting, you could volunteer at a soup kitchen and actually help people. You could spend an hour working and take that money and cure someone of trachoma. That's what you could do. And this is really high because you get social rewards for doing it. And that's probably why we vote. Now, again, it makes sense. If I were a politician, I would implore everybody to vote because, there's reasons to do that. It's important to get a large number of people voting, but it doesn't actually mean that an individual vote makes much of a difference. So why do we vote? What are we doing when we're voting? Should you feel bad if you don't? People say things like, well, what if no one voted? Well, that might be bad, but what if no one farmed? That would be even worse. Doesn't follow that you should be a farmer. It doesn't follow that you should be a voter. If they say things like, if you don't vote, you're free riding on government. I don't know, maybe, but there's a division of labor. I don't make any food, but I pay for it through a different kind of coin. I don't make art, but I pay for the art that I consume a different way. I don't, produce clothing, but I don't free ride on clothing. I pay for it through a different means. So I'm often wary of people like me who do political science and politics for a living telling everyone else that you should be more like us. One other thing, you imagine people might think, well, the election is so important as a whole. Shouldn't you participate in it? Well, here's a way of thinking about it. Imagine that some kids keep drowning in a pool. There's like a pond and people keep falling in, kids keep drowning. And so finally the town gets a bunch of volunteers together to build a fence around that pond. Imagine they get like 1,000 volunteers, but they really only need 100. And you decide to volunteer too. You're one of those 1,000 volunteers. But again, they only really need 100. On your way to help build the fence, as you're driving there, you see a different kid who fell off his bike and broke his leg. It looks to me like it's at least permissible for you to stop and help that other kid rather than help build the fence, even though in a sense building the fence is more important than helping this kid overall. For you, your marginal contribution is really high if you help the kid and basically nothing if you help build the fence. So that seems like a reason to think, well, maybe voting isn't quite as important as we think for an individual level. It's important on a collective level, but not an individual level. I'm going to end by saying part of why voting might not be quite as significant as everyone makes it out to be is because most voters aren't doing what we think they're doing when they vote. In sixth grade, I call this the sixth grade model of political participation. You get taught in a civics class typically that voters have a set of preferences. They learn about how the world works. On the basis of their preferences and their understanding of how the world works, they form an ideology. They then look and find the political party that best matches their ideology, and they vote for that party. Or if that party has very little chance of winning, maybe they vote for like the second best or third best party that has a higher chance. Everybody does this. And as a result, the people who get elected tend to reflect the policy preferences of at least the majority of the public, or at least the median voter, something like that. And they implement our will into policy. And then if they do a bad job, we remember that and we vote them out 4 years later. Empirically speaking, everything I just said is false. The overwhelming majority of voters, they do have preferences in the sense of like they want to be richer, they want to be healthier, they care about concerns, but they don't really learn how the world works. It's incredibly rare for anyone to do that. They don't have ideologies. It's incredibly rare for people to have any kind of stable political preferences. If you want to read some books on that, Neither Liberal Nor Conservative by Kinder and Calmo, Uncivil Agreement by Liniana Mason, and Democracy for Realists by Aiken and Bartels. They will show you the evidence, and if that's not going to do it for you, I can give you other examples as well. They don't actually form preferences, and when they're voting, their behavior when they vote is much more similar to my behavior when I root for the New England Patriots. It's more like sports team fandom and has very little to do with their interests or their ideology. So democracy doesn't quite work the way that we were told it does in sixth grade. And as Aiken and Bartel say, elections are largely random events. Now, what does that all mean? If you want to vote, fine, but the chances that you know what you're doing are pretty low. Your motives in doing it are probably far less noble than you think they are when you trick yourself into thinking they are. If you really wanted to help others, there's lots of other stuff you could do that's way, way better. Remember, I just did more good by donating $100 than all of you will ever do with all of your votes. And, you could spend your time doing something that actually helps. If you do want to be more effective in politics, it's probably more important to be involved in local politics where your vote has more significance and to engage in other kinds of political activities that have even more significance than voting. We make way bigger of a deal of this thing than we should. So with that, I'll stop and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Brennan, for those remarks. And our third panelist today, next we will hear from Dr. Suzanne Dovey, who joins us from the University of Arizona. Dr. Dovey.
Hey, Andrew, I wanted to share my screen. It's not.
Let me see if I can set that up while you get going.
Okay. So if you were to see my screen, what you would see is a person holding their head looking like they are despairing. And what I wanted us to do is to think about the significance of voting during trying times. And so in particular, I'm going to sort of build on what Wendy says and sort of disagree strongly with what Jason said in terms of thinking that this election is really a turning point for democracy. And so I'm going to make some arguments that sort of sustain this. Can you guys see the screen or no? Do you know?
I think I gave you sharing privileges.
Oh, you did. You did. Oh, perfect. Great. Sorry. Okay. So can you just let me know if you can see it? Can you see it? You have to say it.
No.
Oh, okay, hold it. Sorry. Y'all, I'm having one of these days that's a trying time. Okay, here we go. And let's see if I'm going to try downloading my presentation. Okay. Okay, here we go. Okay, now I'm hoping. Okay.
No, unfortunately, no. I'll tell you what, I'll make you the host, and if that doesn't work, then you just got to promise to give me back host privileges when you
I totally promise to give you host privileges back.
There you go.
Okay, hold it. Can you see this now? From start? Can you see that? Yeah. Okay, hold it. Oh my gosh, I am a disaster, and I apologize. Okay, hold it. Share file. Okay. I think it's working.
And you need to hit screen at the top of the box, the little screen at the top.
This little this thing? The little screen? Hold it. I think I got it, Wendy. I'm so sorry, y'all. Okay. Nope.
This is Donna. You can send it to me and I'll share it for you.
Oh, okay. That's a good idea. Here we go. Donna.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Do you see, Suzanne, file, edit, share at the very top of the the bar.
At the top, file,
Edit, and then share and view.
And then share and view, yep.
Okay, so click on share.
It doesn't have anything.
Oh, sorry. Donna, my bad.
Okay.
Send it to me by email.
Okay. Open. Oh, it's loading. It's happening. Y'all, you're gonna like the graphics, and so you're gonna see it was worth it. Okay.
Yes.
There we go.
Okay. I'm so. Okay. Okay, a couple, just while I'm waiting for my thing to think, a couple thoughts. Originally, okay, so you can see it, right? Okay, so first of all, I want to say thank you so much to Andrew Cohen for inviting me to this, and second, also thank the people in the audience, because I know it's hard to watch another Zoom talk, right? And so I am sending out gratitude for your willingness to talk about voting. Okay. All right. So there are a lot of different reasons to vote. I am actually not going to give them, often because they sound like cliches. And I think that when we think about democracy, there's a way in which a lot of what our elected representatives done is made us think it's just empty rhetoric talk. And so there's a way in which you think you're being more realistic if you're more cynical about politics. And when we think about, I agree with Jason Brennan that political scientists have shown that Republicans and Democrats are really bad at representing regular people. However, not voting is not how you make those people listen, right? And so what I'm going to say is that voting is a necessary but not a sufficient activity for democratic governance. Right? So, yes, you need to run for office and you need to get educated about what your elected officials stand for. And you need to contact your representatives and hold them verbally accountable. And you need to hold Fox News accountable when it lies to you. Right? And so being a democratic citizen, sure, you can do, I'm like, yeah, you can donate to the money and get informed, okay? So it's not an either or. What I will tell you is every time there is a peaceful transition in a democracy, it is a miracle, right? That someone with guns gives up the power to use those guns is a miracle. And we have been very, very lucky people. There's a well-known quote that says every democracy commits suicide. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about how democracies are backsliding. So for the first time, the United States is not thought of as a full democracy. We are a flawed democracy. Now, I just want to be clear. We were always a flawed democracy, right? I am not talking about going back to some ridiculously idealized vision of the past in which we ignore, for instance, the violence and totalitarian practices against African Americans in the South. What I am saying, though, is that what is now counting as normal democratic practices is what we're seeing is the undermining of our democracy. And I'm going to try to show you some concrete examples of why I think that's possible. Now, my vision of democracy, as you're going to see, is a little bit cynical. But there's lots of lofty definitions of democracy, and political scientists have honestly a whole industry about how to define democracy. But there are two arguments that I would like to get on the table in our conversation. The first is that democracy is the worst system except for all the others. What that does not tell you is what actually makes democracy better, right? And I'm going to say that the vote is one necessary, but not sufficient for believing it's better. And the second is that one of the democracy is the reoccurring suspicion that more than half of the people are right more than half of the time. My conception of democracy is not based on the belief that people get things right. I think humans get things wrong all the time. And that's why I want to live in a democratic regime. Because what democracy gives us that other forms of democracy, of other forms of governments don't, is an opportunity, not a guarantee, to correct things. And it gives the people who are affected by the ways that government can mess up, right, an opportunity to force that government to correct itself, because people in power will get away with whatever they want. And I don't care if they're smart or virtuous. I don't know how you would even do a virtue test, but what I do know is that I trust people when they are hurting and recognizing when other people in their society are hurting, right, that they have to use the language of democracy. And one of the things you can say is, yes, they get things wrong all the time, but they also get things right. And that's that list. They have gotten public schools. They've gotten 40-hour work weeks. They've gotten civil rights acts. They've got Social Security. So, yeah, recently we've developed a really poor democratic system, and we need to get back on track, people. Okay? So, 2 little lessons for democracy before I go into the scary section of my talk. The first one is if we all knew what we wanted and what the right answer is to our public policy challenges, we wouldn't need democracy. You need democracy when people disagree. And what voting does is it gives you a way to determine how to settle conflicts. Okay? So in this way, because democracy rests on an assumption of pluralism, I also want to say it does not require all democratic citizens to participate in the same way. Some people can be activists. Some people can write op-eds. Some people can talk to their family, talk to their schools. You can participate in a lot of different ways. And you can make a big difference because our world is pretty messed up right now, people. Okay? So the scary part of this talk is about how democracies die. And one thing that we've seen, so this is Daniel Ziblatt and Stephen Levitsky's argument, right, which is they no longer fall because of like a revolution or a military coup. What they often do is the political party gets captured by an extremist group, right? And they get voted out of office. You use democratic procedures to undermine democracy, right? And so what de-democratization looks like now, it looks like normal democratic politics. Right? And that means that you're going to have to put on you're going to have to completely educate yourself in being able to recognize when your democracy is in danger, right? And so because I lost so much time with my thing, I just want to say, like, one thing you can say is you can look at what other authoritarian regimes are doing, and they do things like you don't respect the independence of the court. You dominate the court's election commission. We did not have a federal election commission until May 2020, right? They only have enough votes for a quorum, and so if one person resigns or gets sick from COVID, right, we don't have a functioning federal election commission when we're facing one of the most controversial elections in our history, right? You limit the free press. You call them enemies of the people instead of supporting. You go after people who are critical of you, right? And so these are the tactics we know of how to make a power grab. I'm not going to do this, but because, again, I think I went way over my time and I want to have a conversation. But you can say that, making the Department of Justice or the State Department interested in advancing President Trump's own interests as opposed to the public good, not respecting Congress's subpoena power, ruling by decree instead of using the legislative process, even though I understand why, because we're dealing with representatives who don't compromise, right? But one of the things that we can see, right, is that Trump has circumvented the legislative, which is the power of the people, even though the Congress is probably the most unpopular branch of government, the most popular being the Supreme Court. I would argue that he has circumvented when they don't pass the budget he wants, he overrides the decision to build the wall and provide the bottom wall. So what we see here are a president who's strengthening the power of the presidency, weakening the mechanisms of accountability, the checks and balances that our founding fathers put into place in order to prevent someone from getting everything they want. And he's challenging, and this is probably my one response to Jason, which is he's undermining the validity of our elections, right? And so Jason's argument is very smart, but it works into the hands of someone who's trying to undermine the belief that elections don't matter, right? And what's dangerous about that is because if you take seriously, well, if your vote only matters if there's one vote, if your vote is the decisive vote, that's the way economists and political scientists, they completely ignore how having a large win, right, having a substantial lead is necessary for a mandate that Trump cannot challenge. And one of the fears going into this election is that Trump will not concede because he has undermined the validity of mail-in ballots. He suggested that there's voter fraud, so it's going to take a long time. And so as a result, this is why our election is facing a potential tragedy, right? And so, yes, every vote matters, and if 1 million people vote for your candidate, that is how you have safeguarded our democracy. Okay? I'm just going to skip this, but I want to leave you because we are living in trying times. I want to leave you with some hope, okay? And what I like to say is that whenever I'm feeling about despair, and it doesn't make a difference, and it is hard to believe in democracy right now, people. It is not an easy thing to do, right? But what I want to say is I like to think of all the things that I think have been impossible. I thought it was impossible that the Berlin Wall would fail. I thought it was impossible that South Africa could have a peaceful transition of state. I thought it's amazing that even though it took a war, that the United States, made slavery illegal, right? And my final thing for hope is that if you looked at the 2016 election, this is how the people from 18 to 25 voted, right? So what we can see is that most people, and that's from the vote tally, not the electoral election tally, recognize that Trump was not the ideal candidate. And so our future can look better if we hold on to our democracy. And so my little line is, you need to know now why voting is vital. You need to protect your vote. So if you see voter intimidation, you report it. So Electorland, which is a pro-Republica site, is taking in requests. You can text them when you see voter intimidation. And you need to vote. Like 210,000 lives depend on it, people. And so voting is not just rational, it is necessary for this election. That's all.
Thank you, Dr. Dovey, for those remarks. So before we turn to the Q&A, and please keep questions coming in, there is an exchange going on there, and we'll bring some of those out into the open. Since Suzanne went third, I wanted to offer Jason and Wendy the opportunity to offer some contributions before we turn it over to the general Q&A. Wendy, do you have any thoughts you'd like to offer on the presentations that came after you?
So certainly, one of the things, I'm a scholar of the field of intersectionality, and one of the things that we often talk about in that work is not the either or model, but the both and. And the reason why I make that point is because certainly, as I share with Jason that commitment and interest in people having the feeling altruistic performance of making a donation and being able to make a direct difference. But I would say I want people to do both and. I want people, and I believe people can do both and, which is to make the contribution and to vote, and to think about the ways that both of those things help to strengthen our democracy. I would also say that for the conversations that I'm interested in terms of democracy, is that I want people to vote, and I want them to be informed, and I want them to run for office. And I want them to protest, and I want them to hold politicians accountable, so that no one piece of this puzzle alone equals the ideal democracy, but it's when they're working in concert that we more closely align with our conceptualizations of a democracy.
Jason.
Yeah, I mean, I think I started my talk by saying one thing we really want to do, we have to be careful. We want to be good, analytic, political philosophers. That means distinguishing things, like distinguish the value of democracy as a whole, the value of the institutions as a whole, then distinguish that from the value of votes as a whole and votes as a collection, from the question of what's the value of individual votes, right? We don't want to conflate all three of those things together. If you do that, you end up saying things where you make arguments that are like, here's why democracy is so great, therefore you should vote. And it's like, but you didn't address the issue of the particular value of an individual vote, right? So I tend to think of voting, it should really be more like a jury duty type system where it's important that we have enough people vote, and it's really important that it be representative of the populace as a whole. You know, and so sometimes people say we should force everyone to vote. And I wrote a book on compulsory voting, and I offered an alternative idea, which was, why don't we randomly select 20,000 Americans? They and only they get to vote. We give them the day off. We pay them, say, $4,000 to be voters. No one knows who these people are going to be until like 2 weeks before an election. So there's no like ability to tamper with them. And then only they get to vote. It turns out that if you randomly select 20,000 Americans and only let them vote, they will be more representative of the country as a whole than if you literally forced everyone to vote. The reason for that is that the statistical error rate on 20,000 people voting is lower than the counting rate on having, say, 210 million people vote by quite a bit, right? So I think, you know, should we have everybody vote? Like Suzanne Dovey brought up something about like a mandate. Is it important that a person have like 1 million extra votes? No. I mean, there's a whole bunch of political science in that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect their performance in office. At most, it affects maybe the perception of their legitimacy. And even that, you know, does that really affect the performance of the country as a whole? It affects like how we talk to each other, I guess, like over coffee and the dramatic rhetorical things that we say, but it doesn't actually affect performance. So yeah, the mandate theory is just another falsified theory that we know is not true.
Before we turn to the Q&A, a question that's been fed to me, particularly in light of the mission of this fall's series by the Ethics Center, is to inquire into how to think about how these ethical issues matter for historically marginalized communities. So in light of the various pathologies of democracy that we've heard the speakers mention and the imperfections of our system, many people might say, what are we supposed to do? So if one is concerned about the continuing marginalization of communities of color, or one is coming from such a community, what is the best way for such persons to bring about beneficial and fruitful political change that will help to protect their important political interests and also keep the bums accountable, as it were? I'm wondering if you all have any thoughts on that.
So I'll start with with that piece, because I was one of the things I really hoped we would have an opportunity to talk about, right? In the sense of, I was thinking about the Breonna Taylor case that made it into the vice presidential debates last evening. One of the things that we see is that local elections matter. The district attorney is an elected position. What we are seeing as people are protesting the actions of the district attorney is that they're expressing their distrust, their dissatisfaction with the performance of the district attorney. And on multiple fronts, people have an opportunity in a democracy to respond. One of the ways that we're seeing such a response is through the protest, even through the early handling of the case, right, or the silence around the case. It's because of the level of protest that we saw by people literally in the streets, right, that we were able to bring new attention to that case. That resulted in everything that I have read. That kind of public attention also led to the charges being dropped by around Breonna Taylor's partner in terms of his role in firing his gun in protection of his home and his castle. That was public protest that did that. The people of Kentucky will have an opportunity to voice their positions around the district attorney's handling of the case in voting. So voting and protest matter in concert, particularly for marginalized communities. Because we know that the vote alone has never been the end-all, be-all to how democratic participation works, or how democratic participation will realize protections or realize belonging.
Dr. Dovey, you looked animated with nodding. It looks like you have something to add.
So I just want to tag on. So, I think what they've shown is actually that what you need are elected officials, a bureaucracy that implements policies from the election correctly, and an oppositional civil society that puts pressure on those organizations. And so democracy, one way of thinking about democracy is that it authorizes the decision makers. But if you think about, well, what tools do people who are affected by the laws of the land have to hold their government accountable? That's why you need liberal freedom, like freedom of association, freedom of the press. That you cannot understand how to make your rights effective, altruistically effective, unless you actually have the unless you you live up to your duty to vote, right? So duties correspond with rights. And I would say that if you don't exercise your right to vote, right, you can lose the mechanism of holding your representatives accountable. I did want to say, if it's okay, was one thing in response to what should we think about the vote as what an individual vote matters? And, the way I think about this is if my husband told my kids, you can only play a sports game if you win, right? Or if you think about, if you're climbing Mount Everest and you pass out before the last step, you can't say you climbed Mount Everest because you didn't take that decisive step. What that way of looking at political participation ignores how democracies are about aggregation, right? And I think that Jason is just wrong about whether mandates affect performance. Look, our performance of our government is so low right now because of negative partisanship that that's not the correct measurement for assessing our government. What we do see, though, is, and this is my claim, is that if this election is close, Trump is in a better position to not concede if he loses.
We can go for a couple of spare minutes. There are two people on the panel who have extremely firm commitments after 3:30, and one is Dr. Smooth, and another one is me. There are certain tag team childcare things that are going on. So thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Smooth. We appreciate your time.
Thank you all for having me. Wonderful conversation.
In the one or 2 minutes remaining, I wanted to draw a bit from the Q&A that's going on, and there are a bunch of really good exchanges that are going on there. And one is about, it looks like there's a bunch of things that are being asked about how people might best spend their time given the opportunity costs. And some of these are being directed to Jason. One from Michael Evans is asking, how would Brennan defend on effective altruist grounds the amount of time he has devoted to arguing against democracy and vital democratic institutions like the franchise, given the well-documented advantages of democracy versus non-democratic regimes? And there was a response there from Jason, but let's bring it out into the open.
Yeah, well, I ended up just agreeing with him. I said, obviously my research is much more valuable than most other people's research, but even then it's not really all that valuable. I wrote an entire book actually about like how higher ed is basically ripping off everybody and not justifying its own value. It's called Cracks in the Ivory Tower. It was originally called The Bad Business Ethics of Higher Ed, but it became called The Moral Mess of Higher Education. Did really well. You should read it. Yeah, it's a big joke. So you're absolutely right. And I include myself in that. I actually am self-critical in the book explicitly. I talk about money that I waste and time that I waste and so on. That said, what I say in the book against democracy is the best system we've had so far. But it has certain built-in flaws. We know why these flaws exist. Some of us even go forth and acknowledge them. We know what causes them, and it's because governance matters so much, because the performance of government matters so much. We're deciding issues of life and death, prosperity and poverty, racism or equality. That's what we're deciding as a whole. It's important to look, rather than just like extolling democracy or just putting out this stupid bromide that like the problems with democracy are all fixed by more democracy and ignoring the actual problem. What we should do is like look at the flaws and look for things that can actually fix it. So I suggest something called enlightened preference voting, which is a mechanism that can both de-bias democracy by removing some of the racial and ethnic and class bias, as well as draw out the wisdom of the crowds to produce better political performance. I can't in 30 seconds defend the whole thing, but that's sort of an advertisement for the book. It's democracy is the best. I'm a fan of democracy the way I'm a fan of Iron Maiden. Iron Maiden's a great band, but a lot of their albums in the 90s suck. Democracy is the best of the systems we've come up with so far, but lots of things about it are really awful, and we should fix it.
Thank you. We've already gone over a couple of minutes, so before we depart, I want to repeat our thanks to the panelists, Dr. Smooth, who had to leave firmly at 3:30, and Drs. Brennan and Dovey for their contributions to this issue, continuing this conversation. We have certainly not resolved the issue, but we're hoping to shape the conversation constructively, and we're grateful for your contributions on that. Let me again remind viewers that the details about future events that the Ethics Center is hosting, they are available at ethics.gsu.edu. The next one being this coming Tuesday, October 13th at 3:45 p.m. Eastern Time, featuring two political scientists and the head of the Georgia chapter of the ACLU, discussing ballot access, voter fraud, and voter suppression. Let me again thank you all for joining us today, and I wish you all the best. Please stay well and stay safe and enjoy the autumn. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Andrew, thank you so much.
It's our pleasure, Suzanne. Thank you.
I'm so sorry about the technology. That was stressful. And I'm so sorry.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the invite. Yep.